Well, the country is still reeling after the brutal gang rape of 8 women at an abandoned mine in Krugersdorp over the weekend. Now, just recently, President Cyril Ramaphosa signed into law 3 bills aimed at strengthening the fight against gender-based violence. The bills are also centered around the victim and to help fast-track GBV-related cases. But how effective are these laws in actually combating the scourge of violence against women and children? Let's bring in Bronwyn Pithey, who is an advocate at the Women's Legal Center. We're also joined by Kayan Leung, who is an attorney at Lawyers for Human Rights. To both of our guests, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Bronwyn, I want to begin with you this morning. And on paper, these 3 laws signed by President Cyril Ramaphosa, they look great, but it doesn't just stop there insofar as the fight against GBV is concerned.
No, of course, you're correct. But I think the first thing to say is that it's imperative to have a strong legislative framework to address any of the challenges that we have. So it's essential to have those building blocks in place. And I think that, in fairness, government must be commended for the process by which these 3 pieces of legislation have been fully consulted with civil society and have now been passed in actually realistically quite record time. I know that people get very frustrated with the process and it takes a long time, but realistically this was actually quite a phenomenal feat in terms of the amount of consultation that was done and the engagement together with civil society, the amount of comments that people participated in. So, yes, absolutely. We've got 3 good pieces of legislation which built on already existing legislation, which I think to a large extent has really focused on improving access to justice for people who seek this kind of protection from the state. But you're absolutely right. The proof is going to be in the pudding, and we can really hope that, the full intention of the legislature is realized through the implementation of these pieces of legislation. And time will tell, because these acts are literally coming into operation as we speak. Yeah. One came into operation yesterday, and the Domestic Violence Act in particular, which I think most of us are very excited about, will come into operation at the end of August. And
we'll unpack those 3 pieces of legislation in just a moment, Bronwyn. Kayan, before we do that, I want to bring you into the discussion insofar as, what it's going to take to ensure that the legislation does what it intends to do. I suppose it's going to take a lot of education on the part of victims as well.
Absolutely. I think we need to have a more proactive approach in ensuring that the public are aware of what the procedures are and what their rights are. But we need to make sure that it's distilled in a way, because sometimes legislation is drafted in a way that's very technical and people don't understand how to navigate through systems. So whilst, and I agree with Bronwyn that we have really powerful, important pieces of legislation, I think the gap in between is the implementation and the resourcing that has to accompany it. Otherwise, with a lot of criticism along with a lot of our current laws and legislation, it's just going to be a toothless piece of paper, toothless tiger.
Absolutely. So, Bronwyn, shall we get into those 3 acts? You already talked about the Domestic Violence Amendment Act. The top line here says it extends protection to older persons in abusive relationships. What else does it do?
Well, it does a lot of things, and it'll be quite difficult to go through all the technical aspects, just in an interview. But the biggest import, I think, of this piece of legislation is it's, like I said initially, it's to try and make protection orders, which is a civil remedy for people who are suffering domestic violence, who are victims of domestic violence. It tries to make the access to interim protection orders and protection orders easier. So one of the big introductions, which I think is a very exciting development, is the ability to make applications online. Yep. So one of the biggest barriers to access justice for a lot of, and I'll say women, because most of the victims of domestic violence are women, acknowledging that there are men as well, but if we could just stick with that, understanding that women do suffer the brunt of violence in our country, that those women can actually make application online, because very often women find themselves in a situation where they're either unable to access courts because they're in a dangerous situation, or they literally don't have the resources to attend at court once, twice, 3 times if the order requires or the court process requires them to come to court. Very many women, even if they are hopefully employed will have to take a day off work, if not 2 days. So this is one of the very exciting aspects of it. What it does obviously involve is the department to have a very sophisticated electronic system. So there's also the introduction of what they're calling an electronic depository, where all the information for all applications in domestic violence protection orders will be centralized, so that if they can, firstly they can be implemented nationally, but also that if somebody makes a second or third application, that there is a record of the protection order. So that's just one aspect. Another aspect is something which is called a safety plan. The police are going to have a situation where if a safety plan is issued from the court, means that the police will have to constantly check up on a complainant or a victim of domestic violence after the protection order has been granted, to ensure that even though there is a protection order, there is continued protection. So, and then there's an addition of a whole lot of offences in terms of describing domestic violence, which I think is also very, very, it's an acknowledgement of the nature and the extent of domestic violence which is suffered by so many women.
Yeah. Kayan, there are two other lines in this short excerpt from the Act that really stand out. The issue of the court now punishing bystanderism, this issue that domestic violence is not a family matter. So if you knew about these issues taking place and you did nothing about it, that there will be a sanction for that. And then also, clerks of the court must comply with the execution of their functions insofar as the Act is concerned. And disciplinary steps will be taken if that's not the case.
Yes, so absolutely. So I think the one part the first part you mentioned is the fact that there are specific categories of persons where, if it comes to your knowledge, that there is a domestic violence definition of crime against children, persons with disabilities or older persons, there is an obligation to report that. The Act does not place a general ownership to report any case. So it's those specific cases or groups of people that are facing domestic violence. And of course, certain functionaries that are designated within the Act to have a compulsory reporting mechanism. But that section is here to enable or encourage people to actually start reporting and speaking out against and creating an environment where people that are victims or survivors of domestic violence, that they are able to get the legal recourse. And of course, the second part that you've mentioned, the directives for the clerks, in terms of Section 18 of the Domestic Violence Amendment, it sort of re-establishes or re-emphasizes the duties of the duty bearers, such as the clerks, to actually ensure that they are serving those that are survivors or victims of domestic violence. So one of the high criticisms, in the public discourse is that, even if we do try to report cases or try to get protection orders, et cetera, we are not assisted. We're not taken seriously. Just reinforces that strength and strengthens that mechanism.
Yeah, I mean, there are two more acts that we need to go through for the purposes of our interview. We're getting closer and closer to 7:30, so we're a bit pressed for time, Bronwyn and Kayan. But I do want to go through them. Unfortunately, we're in a country where there are a number of issues colliding insofar as gender-based violence and femicide are concerned. So those two additional pieces of legislation, no more police bail or prosecution bail in gender-based violence and femicide cases, Bronwyn, and then, of course, all convicted sex offenders to be registered in a national register.
Yeah. So the first piece of legislation you refer to is really quite sweeping amendments to the Criminal Procedure Act, which really regulate the way that the criminal justice system deal with all types of offences. And most people will be aware of that there were certain offences that allowed so-called police or prosecutor bail, which meant that the accused does not have to appear in court before they can be released on bail. And previously, so-called lesser offences like assault, simple assault or common assault would often be able to would qualify for police or prosecution bail. Now what they have amended it to, that if the nature of the offence involves an act of domestic violence, by definition from the Domestic Violence Act, then prosecutor and police bail would not be allowed. So it's really, again, acknowledging the seriousness of the nature of the offence in terms of the relationship between the people.
Yeah.
And then, as you mentioned, with the amendment to the sexual offences legislation, there is sweeping amendments there around the National Register for Sex Offenders, where all offenders will now be registered and will be prevented from employment working with vulnerable people. And vulnerable people, that has been extended to, well, it has always been children and people with disabilities, but it now also includes women under the age of 25 who are in particular educational facilities, and then also people who are in particularly vulnerable aspects of care, and then older persons as well. So those people who find themselves on the national register, and it's all sex offenders, will not be allowed to work. And let's just always remember that the National Register for Sex Offenders is really about employment sex offenders and not necessarily about punishment thereafter. And I think that's an important distinction to make.
Yeah, certainly. It's such an interesting time in our country insofar as gender-based violence and femicide is concerned, just because, you know, it's August, it's Women's Month. We tend to focus on these issues more. And then, of course, there are a number of issues that are making headlines at the moment. It's interesting, Kayan, because it's a positive story that we're talking about this morning insofar as the fight against gender-based violence and femicide is concerned. But it's on the backdrop of, again, a whole range of horrifying stories.
Absolutely. I think it just brings to core the urgency of us addressing this. I mean, one aspect is the legislation, and just to re-emphasize that, you know, the different pillars and mechanisms to ensure that there is an adequate implementation of our various plans is really critical. This recent story is just a drop in the ocean of what's actually going on in communities, and so many cases that are unreported in the news to SAPs, etc. So it is urgent, it is a scourge, and we do need to take immediate intervention in this regard. It
is a crisis. Let me thank both of our guests for your time this morning. Bronwyn Pithey is an advocate at the Women's Legal Centre, and Kayan Leung is an attorney at Lawyers for Human Rights. Three incredibly important pieces of legislation signed into law insofar as gender-based violence and femicide is concerned.